Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're digging into a story that's been making headlines all over the place. Lee Kuan Yew. You probably heard the name and maybe you're thinking, wait, who's that guy? Well, stick around because we're going to break it all down. We've got research piled high and ready to go. And let me tell you, this is anything but your average biography. We're talking big achievements, some serious controversy, and well, let's just say some family drama that's worthy of a soap opera.
You could say that again?
So to kick things off, remind us why this Lee Hsien Yang is such a big deal.
Oh, he's a big deal.
All right, we're talking about Singaporean royalty, basically. His father, Lee Kuan Yew, was the founding prime minister of the country. You know, the guys who basically built modern Singapore, and then, get this, his brother, Lee Hsien Loong. He held the same position later on.
Whoa, so it's like growing up in the political equivalent of Buckingham Palace.
Yeah, pretty much so. Imagine this, the People's Action Party, the PAP, they've been running the show in Singapore for decades, like over half a century. They're the dominant force in politics.
Right, so this Lee family, they're at the heart of it all. And Lee Hsien Yang, he doesn't just ride on the family name. He's got his own impressive resume. I mean, the guy gets a double first in engineering from Cambridge.
Cambridge, not just any university.
Right, like that's a big deal. Then he goes and climbs the ranks in the Singapore Armed Forces, becomes a brigadier general. I mean, come on, this guy's a serious overachiever.
Yeah, you're not kidding, and it doesn't stop there.
Yeah.
He moves into the business world, becomes CEO of Singtel, one of the biggest telecommunications companies in all of Asia, and then chairman of the Civil Aviation Authority of Singapore.
Okay, so fighter jets to fiber optics, the guy can clearly handle it all. But here's the thing with a family legacy, like that you'd think politics would be the obvious next step, right?
You'd think so, right? Like following in Dad's footsteps.
Exactly, but for years, Lee Hsien Yang steers clear of the political scene, focuses on his business stuff.
Right. He's got his own path going.
But then in 2020, things take a sharp turn. He joins the opposition party, the Progress Singapore Party, and not only that, he comes out swinging, criticizes the PAP, saying they've lost their way. Talk about a plot twist.
It was a huge deal. You remember what we said about the PAP being the dominant force in Singapore? For a Lee family member to not only join the opposition, but to criticize them publicly, it was unheard of. It shook up the whole political landscape.
So it's like he's saying, I'm not afraid to take on the establishment, even if it's my own family. So what happened? What caused this sudden change?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The sources don't give us a clear-cut answer, but they do hint at him becoming disillusioned with the direction of the PAP. You know, maybe he saw things happening behind the scenes that he didn't agree with.
Okay, so we've got this high achiever who, after avoiding politics for years, suddenly jumps into the ring ready to shake things up. But then he throws us another curveball. He decides not to run in the 2020 elections and says this famous line, Singapore doesn't need another Lee. What was going through his mind at that point?
I know, right? It was a surprise to a lot of people. It was a move that left a lot of people scratching their heads like, what's he up to?
Right. It's like he dipped a toe and tested the political waters and then decided to head back to shore. But don't think for a second that this was the end of the story in 2023. Things get really interesting.
This is where the real drama starts to unfold. Lee Hsien Yang starts hinting that he might run for president of Singapore, which is a pretty big deal. Even though it's mostly a ceremonial position, it still carries a lot of weight. But before anything can happen with that, there's this whole other series of events that just blows up.
Oh, boy. This is where we get into the really juicy stuff, right? Allegations of corruption, defamation lawsuits, exile.
So at the center of all this is something called the Rideout Road allegations. It all revolves around two top government ministers and the fact that they were renting these state-owned properties on this super exclusive street, you guessed it, Rideout Road.
So we're talking about like these massive mansions in one of the most expensive neighborhoods in Singapore, right? I mean, you'd expect the rent to be sky high.
Exactly. But that's the thing. These ministers were paying rents. It seemed way too low. It raised a lot of eyebrows.
And we're not talking about just any ministers. These are Hsien Loong, the Minister for Home Affairs and Law, and Vivian Balakrishnan, the Minister for Foreign Affairs, like two of the most powerful people in the government.
Right. So Lee Hsien Yang, he comes out publicly and starts questioning these low rents, basically implying that these ministers are getting special treatment, you know, hinting at possible corruption at the very top.
Wow, can you imagine the scandal? This isn't just some political squabble. This is an accusation that goes right to the heart of Singapore's reputation for clean government.
Yeah, it was a huge deal. And of course, the ministers, they weren't just going to sit there and take it. They denied any wrongdoing, demanded an apology from Lee Hsien Yang, even threatened legal action if he didn't back down.
So what does he do? Does he cave under pressure?
Nope, not this guy.
Okay.
Remember, he's not afraid of a fight. So instead of retracting his statements, he doubles down, refuses to even participate in the defamation lawsuit that the ministers filed against him.
That's a pretty bold move. I mean, there could be serious consequences.
Well, there were, because he didn't participate in the lawsuit, they basically automatically ruled against him, said he was guilty of defamation, and ordered him to pay a big chunk of money to the ministers.
Okay, so you'd think this is the moment he finally gives up, right?
Not a chance.
Hmm.
Lee Hsien Yang agrees to tight, but he does it in a way that just makes the whole thing even more dramatic.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. Tell me he didn't just write them a check and call it a day.
He did not. He figured out what the rent for those fancy Redoubt Road houses would be for 13.6 months and paid that exact amount. Basically, like he was saying, here's your fair rent, gentlemen.
Oh man, talk about throwing shade. He's playing a whole different game here. It's like he's thinking 5 steps ahead of everyone else.
And the timing of this payment is interesting, too. It happens right before his sister, Lee Ling, dies. She had also been publicly criticizing the government. So was this some kind of final act of solidarity with her? A way to make sure their concerns didn't get swept under the rug?
That's a good question. Was it a political strategy, personal defiance, a gesture of family loyalty? It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely adds another layer to this whole story, and then things get even crazier. Remember that whole presidential run thing? Well, in October 2024, just a few weeks ago, Lee Hsien Yang drops a bombshell.
He announces that he's been granted asylum in the UK, declares himself a political refugee.
Wait, a political refugee from Singapore that's unheard of? What does that even mean in this context? Yeah, it's not exactly the kind of thing you usually hear about with Singapore, right? It's a pretty stable and prosperous country, so for Lee Hsien Yang to claim political asylum, it's a really big deal.
Definitely raises all sorts of questions about freedom of speech and political dissent in Singapore. To get asylum, you usually have to prove that you're in danger because of your political views. So for Lee Hsien Yang to be granted asylum in the UK, it seems like he believes he's not safe in his own country.
I mean, think about it. This is a guy who had every advantage in Singapore. He could have lived a super comfortable life, but instead he chooses to speak out, challenge the government, and now he's leaving everything behind it. Makes you wonder what pushed him to this point. What was he facing that made him take such a drastic step?
Yeah, it's hard to say for sure. The sources don't give specifics about any threats or anything, but you can kind of read between the lines. You know, the defamation lawsuit, the public scrutiny, maybe some stuff happening behind closed doors that we don't know about at all probably contributed to his decision.
So now he's in exile, granted asylum in the UK, and this is where the story takes on a whole new dimension. He's not just a dissenting voice inside Singapore anymore. He's like a symbol of resistance on the world stage.
Right, exactly. Being in exile could give him a much bigger platform to criticize the Singaporean government. He can connect with international organizations and maybe even rally support for political change back home.
This is a guy who's clearly not messing around, even if it means leaving his own country behind. But it's not just about politics either, right? There's a whole family dynamic here that's been affected by all of this.
Oh, absolutely. You can't forget about that.
Yeah.
This whole thing has been unfolding against a backdrop of some serious family tension, especially between Lee Hsien Yang and his brother Lee Hsien Loong.
Right. There's that whole fight over their father's will and what should happen to the family home. Lee Hsien Yang and his sister, they accuse their brother of basically going against their father's wishes and trying to use the house for his own political advantage.
Yeah, and that dispute has been dragging on for years, fueling all kinds of speculation about what's really going on between them. Is it just politics, or is there some deeper personal stuff going on? You know, sibling rivalry, maybe?
It's like a real-life soap opera with power struggles, betrayals, maybe even a bit of tragedy. And it makes you think about how this exile, this very public break, affects the rest of the family. What about Lee Hsien Yang's wife and kids? How are they dealing with all this?
It's hard to know for sure, but it definitely adds another layer of complexity to an already complicated story.
So where does all this leave us? Well, we followed Lee Hsien Yang's journey from his impressive accomplishments to his sudden jump into politics, from the Redoubt Road allegations to his self-imposed exile. It's a story that's captured the attention of a whole nation, and it raises some really important questions about power corruption and how far you can go with dissent in Singapore.
We've seen how someone born into privilege can choose to challenge that very privilege, how he stood up to the establishment even when it meant facing serious consequences and ultimately leaving his home. Whether you see him as a hero fighting for justice or someone with a personal vendetta, his story shows just how powerful individual conviction can be, even when the odds seem stacked against you.
So what's next for Lee Hsien Yang? Will his exile be temporary, or will he use his new platform to keep pushing for change? How will his actions shape the future of Singaporean politics? And maybe the biggest question of all, how will this whole saga affect the legacy of Lee Kuan Yew, the father, whose presence looms large over this entire story? Those are questions that only time will tell.
For now, I encourage you to dive into the sources we've provided, to dig into the details of the allegations, explore the legal back and forth, and really immerse yourself in the personal accounts of everyone involved. This isn't just about headlines and sound bites. It's a look into the complex world of power, family, and the bravery it takes to challenge the way things are. Who knows? Maybe you'll even come to your own conclusions about what drives this fascinating and complex man, Lee Hsien Yang.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll be back soon with more intriguing stories and in-depth analysis. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and as always, stay curious.